It was a bright, bustling Sunday afternoon in Orlando, Florida. The Happy Plate Diner, nestled just a few blocks away from a family amusement park, was alive with the sounds of clinking silverware, laughter, and the steady hum of conversations. Balloons bobbed near the ceiling, children darted between tables, and the smell of grilled cheese and fries wafted warmly through the air. In the middle of it all, Derek Monroe sat stiffly at a corner booth, glancing at his watch every few seconds. He looked out of place in his tailored charcoal gray suit, a man more familiar with boardrooms than booster seats. At 63, Derek was a titan in the world of investment, calculated, sharp, and unshakably composed. But at that moment, he was clearly unsettled. Across the table, his 6-year-old son Oliver sat curled into himself, arms tightly wrapped around his head. The noise, the motion, the crowd, it was all too much. His chest rose and fell in short, shallow breaths, and he rocked gently in place, eyes squeezed shut. Oliver didn't speak. He didn't look around. He didn't even touch the kids' menu the hostess had placed in front of him. He simply shut down. Derek sighed. He reached for his phone, as if checking another email might somehow fix this. But before he could scroll, a commotion erupted near the kitchen. A tray of drinks had tumbled to the floor, followed by the sound of ice scattering and the clatter of glass. One of the waitresses rushed over with a rag, apologizing with an easy laugh as she knelt to clean the mess. Becky Larson was 35, quick on her feet, and always smiling, even when she was dead on her feet. Her apron was smudged with syrup and ketchup, and her curly brown ponytail bounced as she moved between tables. But behind her cheerful eyes was someone who carried more than trays and condiments. She carried rent bills, student loans, and the weight of being the only family her little sister had left. Still, she kept going, every day, because quitting wasn't in her vocabulary. She noticed the boy in the corner booth while grabbing extra napkins from the counter. Most kids his age were bouncing in their seats, sipping sodas, poking at grilled cheese sandwiches. But this one, he looked like he was trying to disappear. Something tugged at her. Without a word, Becky reached into the side pocket of her apron and pulled out a long skinny balloon, bright blue. She gave it a few quick pumps with a hand pump, then began twisting with practiced ease. A tail, a snout, a couple of floppy ears. In less than 30 seconds, a goofy little balloon dog had taken shape. She didn't speak. Didn't ask permission. She simply walked over and gently placed the balloon animal on the table, just inches from Oliver's folded arms. Then she crouched low and gave a soft, silly bark, woof. For a moment, nothing happened. Then barely, just barely, Oliver peeked out from the crook of his elbow. His eyes landed on the balloon dog. Slowly, his fingers uncurled. He reached out and poked the wobbly creature. It squeaked. And then, he smiled. It was faint. Fleeting. The kind of smile you might miss if you blinked. But Derek didn't blink. He'd seen that smile. And he hadn't seen it in months. Oliver hadn't spoken a word since they walked in. The moment they stepped into the bustling diner, the lights, the chatter, the clatter of dishes, it all came crashing down on him like a wave. By the time they reached the booth, he had already begun to shut down. He pressed his palms tightly against his ears and lowered his head to the table, curling into himself as if trying to disappear. Derek barely noticed. He was too busy checking his watch, flagging down a waitress, and finally demanding to speak to the manager about the wait time for their food. His tone was sharp, habitual, businesslike. After all, he was used to being in control. But someone else noticed. Becky had seen children like Oliver before, lost in a world of noise that didn't make sense to them. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. From her apron, she pulled out a long sky-blue balloon, twisted it with quick, practiced hands, and shaped it into a floppy-eared dog. Then she approached quietly and placed it on the table in front of Oliver. Still, she said nothing. She simply bent down so her eyes were level with his and gave the balloon a gentle nudge, making it wobble as she whispered, "Woof." There was silence. Then, like the sun peeking through heavy clouds, Oliver lifted his head. His eyes met hers, wide and blinking. And just before they turned away, a tiny, almost invisible smile crept onto his face. Derek returned to the table just in time to see it. He froze, words catching in his throat. That smile. It had been so long. After the food finally arrived, and after Oliver, surprisingly, nibbled at his fries while keeping the balloon dog cradled in his lap, Derek found himself watching his son in a way he hadn't in years. Not as a problem to solve, not as a case study in what wasn't working, but simply as a child who had just smiled. It was a strange feeling, unfamiliar and heavy, pressing somewhere deep in his chest. Becky continued working, darting between tables, refilling drinks, offering extra napkins with that same worn but genuine smile. She didn't linger near their booth. She wasn't fishing for compliments or tips. Whatever she'd done, it hadn't been for show. When Derek and Oliver stood to leave, the boy clutched the balloon dog like it was a treasured toy, not just a bit of latex and air. Derek hesitated, then turned back toward the waitress. She was wiping down a nearby table when he approached. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quieter than usual. It surprised even him. Becky looked up. "Yes, sir." He glanced at his son, who now stood near the door, gently bouncing the balloon animal in his hands. "My son. He hasn't smiled like that for anyone in a long time. Especially not in public. Especially not in a place this noisy." Becky blinked, then shrugged with a soft smile. Maybe the dog was just too silly not to smile at. Derek paused, staring at her as if trying to figure out a puzzle no one else could solve. "What did you do exactly?" She looked down at the rag in her hands. "I didn't do anything special. Just noticed he was overwhelmed. Sometimes, you don't need to say a lot. You just need to speak their language. And balloon animals are that language. For some kids? Sure." She chuckled. "They don't judge. They don't expect eye contact. They're just fun." He nodded slowly. His mind was racing with questions, but he could sense she wasn't the type to talk herself up. And something about that made him trust her more. "Do you do this often? With kids?" "Used to," she said. "I trained for birthday parties, entertainment stuff. But that didn't pay the bills. So, now I serve pancakes and mop up chocolate milk." Derek studied her, noting the tiredness in her eyes, the sincerity behind her smile, and the way she didn't try to impress him, not even once. She simply was who she was. And somehow, that had reached his son more than years of therapists and specialists ever had. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek black business card, and held it out. Becky raised an eyebrow. "You offering me a job or something?" "Not quite," Derek said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But I'd like to talk again. About Oliver. About what just happened today." She took the card, glanced at the embossed name, Derek Monroe, CEO, and let out a low whistle. "Well, that explains the suit." "Don't let the suit fool you," he replied. "I'm just a dad trying to understand his kid." Becky tucked the card into her apron. "And I'm just a waitress with a bag full of balloons." They both glanced over at Oliver, who was now tapping the balloon dog's nose against the glass door, giggling quietly to himself. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, Becky was halfway through rolling silverware when a man in a navy suit walked into the diner, looking completely out of place among the bright booths and the clatter of breakfast rush. He wore designer shoes, carried a leather folder, and scanned the room like he wasn't used to waiting for anyone. "Excuse me," he said, approaching the counter. "I'm looking for Becky Larson." Becky glanced up from the prep station, her hands still moving on autopilot. "That's me. What's going on?" He smiled politely and extended a card. "My name is Mason Everett. I work with Mr. Derek Monroe." Her brows lifted. The suit from yesterday? The same. Mr. Monroe asked me to speak with you. He was very moved by how you interacted with his son. Becky wiped her hands on her apron, taking the card slowly. I just made a balloon dog. Mason nodded. And yet it meant something real. Mr. Monroe would like to invite you to spend some time with his son, Oliver. A few afternoons a week. Nothing too formal, just being there. Like you were yesterday. Becky blinked, thrown off. You're saying, he wants to hire me? Not exactly in any official role, Mason said carefully. Just someone Oliver seems to trust. Someone who speaks his language. The words hung in the air. Becky felt her chest tighten, not from excitement, but hesitation. She leaned against the counter and sighed. Look, she said, I know what you saw yesterday. But that was a fluke. I mean, yeah, I trained a little for parties and all, but I once tried running a birthday for a group of kids with autism. It was a disaster. One boy cried for 20 minutes straight, another had a meltdown because I ran out of purple balloons, and I left thinking maybe I wasn't cut out for this. Mason listened, his expression patient. I don't have a degree, Becky added. No certification, no letters after my name. Just balloon dogs and a smile. And maybe, Mason said gently, that's exactly what Oliver needs. She looked down at the business card again, then toward the window where sunlight spilled across the floor. She could see her reflection in the glass, hair frizzy from steam, apron stained, eyes a little more tired than she remembered. She'd come to terms with where her life had landed. Serving pancakes to families, scraping tips together to help her sister get through college. Dreams of being something more had faded a long time ago. But then there was that moment, Oliver's smile. Small. Fleeting. But real. Does he even want me there? She asked quietly. Mason smiled. Mr. Monroe said Oliver pointed at the balloon dog this morning. When he asked what it meant, Oliver wrote just one word, Becky. That undid her. She swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded slowly. Okay. I'll come. I'll try. No expectations, Mason assured her. Just bring the balloons. Becky gave a shaky laugh. Good. Because that's about all I've got. Becky had rehearsed a dozen ways to politely decline the offer on the drive over. She told herself it wasn't her place, that she'd probably just make things worse. But the second the front door opened and she stepped into that quiet, sunlit living room, all of that disappeared. Oliver was sitting cross-legged on a thick rug, a box of unused toys beside him. He didn't look up, not right away. But then he did. And when his eyes met hers, wide and curious, something shifted. He didn't flinch. He didn't hide. Instead, he reached into the box beside him, pulled out the deflated remains of the blue balloon dog from the day before, and held it out with both hands. As if to say, you came back. Becky's throat tightened. She hadn't expected that kind of welcome. She hadn't expected to feel anything, really. But in that moment, it wasn't about jobs or expectations or fear of failure. It was just about a little boy who remembered her. And for Becky, that was enough to stay. There were no formal sessions. No clipboard notes or white coats. Becky didn't come with a plan or a curriculum, just a canvas tote bag full of colorful balloons and a heart wide open. Each visit began the same. She'd walk through the grand echoing halls of Derek Monroe's estate, feeling entirely out of place beneath the chandeliers and polished marble floors. But all of that vanished the moment she stepped into Oliver's playroom. He'd be there, waiting. Sometimes curled up in the corner, sometimes sitting by the window, but always watching. And always, when he saw her, his lips would curl into the tiniest smile. Becky would drop her bag by the rug and plop down beside him with a dramatic huff, like she'd just completed a long, exhausting mission. Okay, Mr. Oliver, she'd say with mock seriousness. What's today's masterpiece? Dinosaur? Spaceship? Giraffe with sunglasses? He never answered out loud, but his eyes did. Wide, focused, gleaming with quiet excitement. She'd pull out a few balloons, green for dinosaurs, orange for tigers, silver for futuristic flying machines, and start pumping and twisting. Oliver watched everything, soaking in each movement. Sometimes, he'd reach out and touch the balloon mid-twist, guiding her hand. Other times, he'd make tiny gestures, pointing or nodding, letting her know when she got it just right. One afternoon, she made a 3-headed dragon with wings that flapped when you squeezed its tail. Oliver clapped silently, then hugged it so tightly one of the heads popped. Instead of retreating, he laughed, a high, breathy chuckle that caught Becky so off guard, she nearly cried right there on the rug. Another day, they made a hot air balloon complete with a paper cup basket and 2 balloon passengers, one with curly hair just like Becky's. Oliver placed that one carefully in the front seat. It became their rhythm. A language spoken without words. Becky didn't teach him anything in the traditional sense, and yet every session was a breakthrough. His eye contact improved. His shoulders relaxed. He began to initiate, the tiniest of actions, like handing her a balloon or pointing to colors without prompting. And through it all, Derek watched from a quiet distance. Most days, he'd sit in the hallway just outside the room, pretending to scroll through emails. But occasionally, Becky would glance over and see him leaning slightly forward, listening, watching, learning, in his own way. She never called attention to it. Never made it awkward. If anything, she respected how carefully he was trying to understand this boy, his boy, in a way money and power had never taught him. Becky didn't call what she was doing therapy. It wasn't. It was play. It was presence. It was balloons and smiles and a willingness to sit in silence until that silence turned into trust. And slowly, visit by visit, trust became joy. Oliver still hadn't spoken a single word. But laughter was a different story. It came in small bursts, quiet and sudden, like a bird startled into flight. At first, it had surprised even him. The first time a balloon popped in Becky's hand with a sharp bang, he'd flinched, throwing his hands over his ears. Becky had gasped, wide-eyed, and started apologizing. But then, to her astonishment, she heard a soft giggle from behind those tiny palms. From that day on, every accidental balloon pop came with a little dance of emotions. Flinch, pause, and then that unmistakable giggle. Becky started making a game of it. "Oh," she'd say, exaggerated and wide-eyed, pretending the balloon had betrayed her. "This one must have had a bad attitude." Oliver would press his hands to his ears in anticipation, shoulders tensed in excitement, already smiling before the next balloon even met its fate. Those giggles became part of their routine. And slowly, someone else began to take notice, not just from behind the door. At first, Derek had stayed out of the room entirely, choosing to keep a professional distance. He told himself it was better that way, that Oliver needed space, that this strange arrangement wasn't permanent. But deep down, something pulled at him every time he heard that soft sound, his son's laugh. So one afternoon, he stepped inside. Just a few feet. Just enough to lean against the doorframe. He didn't say anything. Didn't interfere. He simply stood there, watching a woman with tired eyes and an apron full of balloons coax joy out of a boy the world had deemed unreachable. Becky noticed him, of course. But she never broke her rhythm. She didn't perform for him. She didn't change the way she spoke to Oliver or dramatize the balloon creations. She just kept being herself, silly, patient, present. And that somehow made it easier for Derek to stay. Each visit, he moved a little closer. From the doorway to the armchair in the corner. From the armchair to the edge of the playmat. Always silent, always composed, but undeniably there. He began to observe things he hadn't allowed himself to see before, the way Oliver tracked Becky's hands with laser focus, how he chose specific balloon colors with subtle nods, how he bounced ever so slightly when she said, "Tada," like he was applauding inside. Derek noticed how his son connected, not through words, not through therapy plans but through joy. Through play. Through Becky. One afternoon, Becky handed Oliver a red balloon shaped like a heart with tiny wings. "It's a love bug," she announced, grinning. Oliver took it gently. He turned to Derek for a brief moment and held it up, eyes wide as if to say, "Look, Dad." Derek's heart skipped. That moment, small, wordless, felt larger than any boardroom victory, any quarterly return. It was connection. It was a bridge being built between them, one balloon at a time. And for the first time in years, Derek didn't feel like a businessman trying to fix a problem. He felt like a father watching his son come back to life. The house was quiet that evening, but not peaceful. Derek stood near the window of his study, a glass of untouched bourbon in his hand, watching the evening sun bleed orange across the horizon. Behind him, soft murmurs echoed through the wide halls, voices of those who had served in his home for years. The cook, the housekeeper, the chauffeur. All familiar. All loyal. And all quietly skeptical. "She's sweet, but she's not trained," one of them had said, when they thought Derek was out of earshot. "It's just a phase. The boy will lose interest," another added. "A waitress with balloons can't replace real therapy. This isn't sustainable." Derek didn't respond. He never did when emotions were involved. Instead, he carried those words like stones in his chest, letting them settle where doubt had already begun to stir. He had built his life on logic. On numbers, projections, and calculated risk. Emotion was not part of the equation. And yet, here he was, torn by something no spreadsheet could quantify. Every time Becky walked through the door, Oliver lit up. Not just smiled, lit up. The boy who once cowered from eye contact now waited by the window. The child who used to flinch at touch now reached out willingly, guiding her hand as she twisted balloon animals. And Derek had seen it with his own eyes. Still, the voices rang in his head. A real solution needs real credentials. This will fall apart the moment she leaves. You're letting feelings cloud your judgment. But feelings, those unpredictable, inconvenient feelings, were the very thing he'd been desperate to see in his son. And for the first time in years, they were there. Real. Tangible. So why did doubt still claw at him? He took a sip of the bourbon, the bitterness grounding him. Maybe it was fear. Fear that this fragile connection, this glimpse of something real, could vanish as quickly as it appeared. Fear that he was wrong to believe in something as small and human as a waitress with a balloon. But deeper than the fear, beneath the layers of pride and precision, Derek knew something else. She had reached his son. No degree. No therapy plan. No medical explanation. Just kindness. Patience. And a little blue balloon. He stared out into the darkening sky, jaw tight, heart heavier than he cared to admit. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was temporary. But for Oliver's smile, he'd take that chance. It started with a 30-second clip. A regular diner customer, someone who had seen Becky and Oliver weeks ago, during that first magical moment, had taken a short video on their phone. In the clip, Oliver was giggling, cheeks pink with joy, holding a balloon giraffe while Becky sat cross-legged beside him on the diner floor, pretending to make the balloon roar like a lion. It was innocent. Sweet. Heartwarming. Until it wasn't. The video hit social media with a headline designed to stir: "Billionaire hires waitress to entertain disabled son, replaces therapy with balloon animals?" Within hours, it spread like wildfire. By morning, it had been picked up by local news blogs and parenting forums. By noon, it was on national talk shows. Commentators weighed in with furrowed brows, questioning the wisdom and responsibility of a billionaire father entrusting his vulnerable child's emotional progress to a woman with no credentials. "She means well, but this is dangerous," one expert said on air. "This is what happens when the ultra-rich believe they can buy happiness instead of following science," another commented. "It's irresponsible. That child needs therapy, not party tricks." Becky saw the video while on break behind the diner. She froze as the clip played again and again, Oliver's joy, her laughter, and then the headlines. Her hands trembled. She wasn't angry. Just devastated. The moment that had meant everything, Oliver's first real connection, was now being reduced to ridicule. Her intentions, twisted. Her presence, questioned. Back at the Monroe estate, Derek read through the growing pile of media alerts in silence. He scrolled through comments calling Becky a fraud, a distraction, an unfit influence. His chest tightened. He remembered Oliver's face just that morning, watching the balloon hover above his bed, pointing and smiling before breakfast. The child had hope in his eyes. But now? Now that hope was under siege. Calls started coming in, from the board, from colleagues, even from his ex-wife. They wanted to know why he was allowing a waitress to play therapist. "She's not trained, Derek. What are you thinking?" He didn't answer. Because deep down, he wasn't sure anymore. Not because he didn't believe in Becky, but because he feared what this media frenzy could do to Oliver. He paced the study, clenching and unclenching his fists. If he kept Becky close, the scrutiny would only intensify. But if he pushed her away, what would happen to his son? Later that evening, Becky received a knock on her apartment door. It was Mason. His eyes were tired. "Mr. Monroe wanted me to thank you," he said gently. "And he thinks it's best to pause your visits. Just until things settle down." Becky didn't cry. She just nodded, her voice catching as she whispered, "Tell Oliver I'll miss him." Mason hesitated, then handed her a sealed envelope. Inside was a folded note and a check. She didn't open the check. She just sat there, staring at her hands, remembering the way Oliver had smiled, not because she was a therapist, but because she saw him. Or concerned parent. It had come from a disgruntled former employee of the diner, a line cook who'd been fired weeks earlier for showing up drunk on the job. The account used to upload the clip was linked to his email. He had twisted the narrative out of spite, trying to stir up controversy. Becky hadn't known. She hadn't staged anything. She had nothing to gain. She was innocent. When Mason handed Derek the printed report, complete with timestamps and IP logs, Derek read every word in silence. Then he placed the pages on his desk, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling. He had made a mistake. Down the hall, Oliver had changed too. Since Becky's last visit, the boy had gone quiet again. He didn't wait by the window anymore. Didn't reach for the balloon bag Derek had tried to bring in as a substitute. He wouldn't even glance at the toys they once played with together. But what caught Derek's attention most was the way Oliver began tugging at the shelf where Becky's yellow balloon dinosaur had been carefully left behind. Over and over, he'd point at it, then shake his head. "Do you want me to move it?" Derek asked one morning, kneeling beside him. Oliver hesitated, then nodded. Derek gently lifted the balloon from its spot. It had held up surprisingly well, its chubby little body still smiling, the note still taped to its back. "Where should I put it?" Derek asked. Oliver didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked over to a nearby drawer, pulled out a crayon, and sat on the rug. His movements were slow, a little clumsy. Writing was never something he tried to do much. But now, with careful effort, he pressed each letter into the page. Derek watched, heart caught in his throat. When Oliver was done, he turned the paper around. In large, uneven letters, it read, "Balloon no fun without MS Becky." Derek stared at the note for a long time, his throat tight. The message wasn't just about a balloon. It was about connection. Trust. The kind of trust that had taken Becky weeks to build, that had brought color back into his son's eyes. And he had walked away from it. He had let fear, of headlines, of judgment, cloud what truly mattered. Folding the note, Derek stood and placed it on his desk beside the report Mason had given him. Then he picked up his phone. "Get her back," he said quietly. Whatever it takes. Derek sat alone in the playroom that evening, the balloon dinosaur resting in his hands, the note from Oliver still lying open on the rug beside him. He had spent a fortune over the years, on experts, clinics, therapies that came with polished resumes and framed degrees. All of them promising breakthroughs. All of them leaving empty-handed. And yet, it had been a waitress, with no formal training, no credentials, who'd brought light into his son's world. It wasn't about skill. Not in the traditional sense. It was about something deeper. Becky hadn't approached Oliver like a case to fix. She hadn't measured his reactions or timed his progress. She had simply met him where he was, with patience, silliness, and an open heart. She hadn't just seen his son. She'd understood him. In a way no specialist ever had. That realization hit Derek harder than he expected. It humbled him. All this time, he'd been searching for the right method, the right science. But what Oliver needed wasn't in a manual. It was human. And Becky had given him that, freely, gently, without asking for anything in return. Derek looked out the window, his voice barely a whisper. She speaks his language, and I didn't even know it existed. The bell above the diner door chimed softly as Derek stepped inside. It was a quiet afternoon, slow, unhurried, the kind of day when time felt like it moved in soft waves. Becky was refilling the ketchup bottles behind the counter, hair tied back, apron a little wrinkled, just as before. But when she turned and saw him, something in her expression shifted. Surprise first. Then hesitation. He wasn't in his usual tailored suit. No polished shoes, no bodyguard waiting by the car. Just a man holding something in his hands, carefully, protectively. A balloon. Or at least, what used to be one. Encased in a clear resin display, the yellow dinosaur now sat preserved, frozen mid-smile. The tiny note she had taped to its back still visible beneath the shine. Becky set the ketchup down slowly. I thought you had a whole world of professionals to choose from, she said, trying to sound light. Ones who don't pop balloons or make goofy sound effects. Derek stepped closer, voice steady but low. You did something none of them ever could, he said. You made my son laugh. You reached him in a way I didn't think was possible. And I let fear, noise, get in the way of that. He placed the preserved balloon dinosaur on the counter between them. I can buy companies, he said. I can build skyscrapers. But I can't buy trust. I can't buy her smile. And you gave him that. Becky looked down at the little figure, her throat tightening. I'm not a therapist, Derek. I'm not. I know, he said, gently interrupting. And that's exactly why it worked. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he added quietly, come back. Not as a waitress. Come back as what you really are. A few months later, the community center hosted its first ever balloon and bond session, an interactive program for children with social anxiety and developmental challenges, using balloon art, color play, and emotional connection through shared creativity. Leading the room was Becky, no apron, no menu pad. Just her, a tote bag full of balloons, and a wide, radiant smile. In the corner, Derek sat watching. And next to him, Oliver held a red balloon dog in his lap, turning toward the crowd just as Becky called out. Who wants to introduce their balloon buddy? Oliver stood. And for the first time, he didn't write anything down. He simply pointed toward Becky and said, clear and proud, she's my friend. The room fell silent as Oliver stepped onto the small stage. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched a red balloon dog, its ears a bit uneven, its tail bent from being hugged too tightly. The crowd was filled with parents, therapists, and teachers, people who understood just how much it had taken for this little boy to stand there. Becky stood off to the side, watching with her heart in her throat. She hadn't asked him to speak. She hadn't even known he would come. But here he was, eyes scanning the room, then turning toward her. He didn't look nervous. He looked sure. He held the balloon dog up to his chest and took one deep breath. Then, in a clear, steady voice, he said, "Miss Becky is my friend." A pause. And then, applause. Not polite, not obligatory, but full, raw. Parents wiped away tears. One therapist placed a hand over her heart. And Becky? She couldn't move. Her eyes shimmered with quiet disbelief. That one sentence, just 5 simple words, was more than a milestone. It was a miracle. Because miracles don't always come with lightning or fanfare. Sometimes they come quietly, wrapped in a squeaky balloon, handed over with a smile. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to kneel on the floor, speak in silly voices, and believe in a child when the world says he's unreachable. Sometimes, a balloon isn't just a balloon. It's a bridge. A beginning. A breath of courage blown into the heart of a scared little boy. And the one who dared to blow that breath? She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a specialist. She was just Becky. And for Oliver, she was everything. If you believe that even the smallest act of kindness can lead to something extraordinary, please give this video a like. And if you'd like to continue walking with us through more heartwarming human stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Thank you so much for watching until the end. We'll see you next time.